Good evening, everybody. I am, as Jen said, I'm Bonnie Newmeyer, a longtime neighborhood activist in Over the Rhine and co-founder of Peaslee Neighborhood Center. I want to give a big warm welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening for this public education event about the need for an inclusionary housing policy here in Cincinnati. A number of organizations are co-sponsoring this event, which speaks to the importance of the topic. We want to shout out gratitude to all of them. In addition to Peaslee Neighborhood Center, there is All in Cincinnati, LISC of Greater Cincinnati, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition, Over the Rhine Community Housing, Cincinnati Action for Housing Now, Community Matters, Action Tank, Cincinnati NAACP, Legal Aid Society of Greater Cincinnati, and the Women's City Club of Greater Cincinnati. So a big thank you to all of you for co-sponsoring this with us. In the 50 years that I've been involved in community work, housing for people with limited incomes has always been an issue. Families in my neighborhood, and I'm sure in yours, are hard pressed finding housing they can afford. It's a crisis in this city and across the country that begs for solutions. I feel we have a moral obligation to push for policies that can help legislate equitable development so people have both access to needed housing and protection from displacement. Market forces left alone will not make this happen. Inclusionary housing policy is just one tool of several that needs to be put in place so that we can truly say we are moving towards housing justice in this city. Peaslee is in a unique position to offer support in this arena. Our staff, particularly the research, knowledge, and expertise that Jen Ahrens and Joelle Newman have gained in developing the Equitable Development Rubric and Toolkit, along with hours of sharing their findings with other community councils and groups, is a rallying cry for all of us to get on board to bring an inclusionary housing policy to fruition. So I'm going to hand this off now to Joelle Newman.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bonnie, and good evening, everyone. We want to thank you all just again for joining us. We know that this is a topic that's been talked about a lot recently, and so we're excited. As Bonnie mentioned, Peaslee specifically has been kind of doing research and analysis on inclusionary housing for about over 4 years now, and so we're really excited just to share a little more about what we've learned, the cities and the research that we've looked to, and kind of the expertise that we're excited to hopefully bring to the city here soon. But kind of before we talk more about inclusionary housing policy and what it means as a policy, we just want to kind of offer more of a framework or kind of center the conversation or the discussion that we'll be having this evening around kind of the central problem and the central need. So when we think about equity policies and when we think about the policies that are most effective and most impactful in neighborhoods and in communities and in cities, they're intentional on centering where the need is and addressing the kind of root problem. And so specifically our need here in Cincinnati, which is a need that we know is related to almost every city within the country, is that our housing equity is not simply a byproduct of growth and development. And so equity is not at odds with growth in a growing city. And we've been grateful to see how Cincinnati has grown, but what's been happening more is that there's still discrimination being experienced by folks who may not make a lot of money. And so when we think about equity and when we think about equity as it relates to policy, equity has to be intentionally built into our policy decisions and in the conduction of how we do public business and how we choose to grow our city. And so as we know, Cincinnati can feel like an affordable city to a lot of people, but there's still tens of thousands of residents who can't find housing that's affordable to them. And so when we think about what our central problem is, we know that this can play out across racial lines, and especially this is disproportionately felt by residents of color. And so they're impacted by being cost burdened by their housing, And we recognize that housing struggles are connected to two sides of the same coin. So one side is that the housing is too high. So housing prices are above what people make, but then the other side is the wages that people are paid. And we know that these are explicitly connected. And so when we think about public policy, it's important to also address public policy on the labor and wages side. But tonight, our time with you all is going to be spent mostly talking about the housing cost side. I also just want to address that we are going to discuss a lot of information. We're going to throw a lot of information out. It can be a lot to take in. So throughout the evening, you can put your questions within the chat and we'll have someone who's going to be navigating that for us. And we're mostly going to address questions at the end. So feel free to use the chat all throughout the presentation with any questions, anything that you would like for us to address, and we'll address those at the end. And so as I mentioned, equity isn't a natural byproduct of growth. And so as we've seen in our city, despite growth and development, folks at the bottom of the economic ladder remain left out. So people, even though Cincinnati has seen growth, we've seen development in areas that hadn't been seeing private development for years and at times decades. But still the central problem of folks who are strapped with their economic resources, not being able to find housing that they can afford, it still remain the same. And so when we think about addressing the central problem, it's really connected, and it's because the private market on its own doesn't produce the units that we need. And that's because the private market naturally discriminates. And so we fall short in providing public alternatives for folks. And so similar cities across the country are in a current housing crisis that, again, disproportionately is experienced by marginalized people. And so most resources that are used to develop housing at our city's greatest needs, which we'll kind of talk about in a second, come from state and federal levels. But even these resources fall short in addressing kind of where the need is. And so because of this kind of disconnect between what the federal and the state are providing in resources, a lot of cities and local municipalities and local jurisdictions have stepped up to kind of fill that gap to address the central problem and the central need. And so I also just want to add that even though this is going to be a lot of information and we're going to be kind of doing more webinar style as far as what we're sharing, we do want to have kind of interaction. So we will be having audience polls throughout the event, just with a few facts regarding some of the information we're talking about. So regarding this kind of conversation on our housing crisis locally and then on a national level, Liz, if you could pull up our first poll. Our first poll is just kind of discussing some of the things that are being experienced by people. So it just talks about 19 million US households qualify for federal housing assistance from HUD. Roughly what percentage of these single households actually receive that subsidy that they're eligible for? And so you can go ahead and also display our correct answer. And so I feel like this is kind of right on the money as far as the level or the households that are cost burdened. And so only out of the 19 million households that qualify for the subsidy, only 24, so the correct answer is 24%. So only 24%, so about a quarter of people who receive subsidy or qualify for subsidy actually are able to find housing along with their subsidy. So it just really demonstrates, again, the crisis that our city and our nation is currently in with regards to affordable housing and how that really relates to the crisis and how we need to address it with some of our public resources. And so connected to this central problem is also the fact that we have a specific need. And so our specific need here in Cincinnati, which is, again, similar to what is being seen nationally, is that equity in housing calls for a focus at our lowest income levels. And so we'll have kind of a discussion about what that means regarding rents and how that translates here in Cincinnati. But Cincinnati's major housing deficit is at our lowest income levels, which specifically is before, we'll be using this term called AMI or area median income, but it's specifically below 60% AMI, which is about for one single income earner in one individual, like for a single income earner, without any additional people that they're supporting is about $35,000 a year. And especially below 30% AMI. And so again, using that same example of a single income earner and they're not financially responsible for anyone else, that's about an income of minimum wage. And so between that level, between about $35,000 a year and below, is where our greatest needs are. And these are the households who are most struggling to find housing that's affordable to them in our region. And just so people can kind of have greater context, when we talk about area median income, that's determined at the federal level. So our federal government kind of decides each region's like median income, like basically what is like the area's median income. But the region doesn't just encompass the city and it doesn't just encompass the county. And so here in Cincinnati, our region actually encompasses 15 different counties. And many of those counties or that metric is often significantly higher than Hamilton County, like the incomes that most people see in Hamilton County, and even more kind of exacerbated for the incomes that are seen here in the city. And so it really just shows the crisis and also the pinch that a lot of families are feeling. Because even on a federal level, what's kind of identified as what should be affordable feels strong or feels too tight for a lot of people. And so median rents here in Cincinnati, they hover at prices kind of deemed affordable for households earning roughly 70 to 80% AMI. And so this helps us see that the need for housing is not equal across all price points. So when we talk about, again, equity being built into our policies, it's important to stay specific to the need and what we know is lacking or where people are struggling to find housing and not use our policies to produce things that are already being produced kind of by market forces. And so that is kind of centralizing our essential need and then also our specific problem here within our region.
Yeah, so Jen Ahrens again here. I'm going to jump in to try to expound a little bit on what Joelle is articulating, right? So we wanted to use this graphic to show you sort of the best way to pinpoint where the housing need is, right? And the best way to do that is to look at cost burden, right? So this graphic displays HUD data in the city of Cincinnati, and it's sort of divided into income ranges, just like Joelle said, and those AMI levels, those represent different income ranges, right? In this graphic, the households that are spending less than 30% of their income on their housing are represented in green, right? And HUD considers those households to be living affordably in their housing, right? So if you're not spending more than roughly a third of your income, that's considered by HUD to be affordable to you. In contrast, right, in the orange and red ranges in this graphic, we have households who are spending more than that 30%, right? So HUD considers these households to be cost burdened, right? Like they're spending an unsustainable amount of their income on housing. Within this range, right, the red represents households who are severely cost burdened, meaning that they're spending more than half of their income on their housing alone, right? So that's folks at the bottom of the economic ladder who have no dollars to spare, right? And it's an unsustainable situation, right? Like we have other basic needs that we have to pay for. If we are spending more than half of our income on housing with nothing else to stretch, then we are we're essentially teetering on the brink of homelessness. So this explains a lot, right? It explains what we need to do. It explains why our shelters are full, why people are sleeping on our streets, and offers us great clarity with what we need to do publicly together with our citizenry, with our government. I want to point out, like when we talk about affordable housing in our like capitalist development world, we often hear like, oh, the numbers don't work, right? Like, oh, it would be really nice to do that, but the numbers don't work. That's you can't make the investment numbers work, the development numbers work. I just want to acknowledge, like, if you want to know like where the numbers don't work, truly don't work, and where they never will, right? It's here, right? Where folks are trying to afford their basic human needs and rights in a system that doesn't fairly pay them, and that asks you to compete for like basic dignified conditions, right? Like this offers us a moral imperative and a civic responsibility. I also want to just make a note here about the term workforce housing, because we hear that a lot in our city and in other cities about what we need, right? And there seems to be like confusion over like what should we be subsidizing and incentivizing and like, we need workforce housing, right? And that term is extremely misleading when used in certain contexts, right? So most people use this term to describe housing that's priced to be affordable to households between 80 and 120% of AMI, right? So like, I think we can all agree that folks who are earning in that range like deserve to be able to live in our city, and we want them to live in our city. But like, look at the data, right? The data shows us that Cincinnati's market, right? Those two columns on the right, right? That Cincinnati's market's already meeting the need of those households, right? Like folks are not hard pressed at those income ranges to find housing in our city, right? And that rings true with what Joelle said about our median rents, right? Like those rents are above what Cincinnati's median rents are. And that like the term workforce housing, I think, blurs the reality that most working people, right? Working people in Cincinnati are not, they're down in these other, at the lower end of those ranges with just an unsustainable situation, right? In terms of trying to find housing. So, and because their jobs pay them less, right? So, Liz, if you don't mind, can you pull up poll number 2? And I just want to show you, right? So again, based on what Joelle said about the AMI levels being at the metro area level, I wanted to ask you, right? So like, which of the following do you think represents the monthly cost, right? So that's supposed to be rent plus basic utilities of a 2-bedroom apartment priced at 80% of the Cincinnati metro area median income, right? Where do we think? So we're talking 80%. So that is arguably at the lower end of what people consider workforce housing. Oh, 80% is affordable housing. It's workforce housing. That's what Cincinnati needs. That's what we should be subsidizing. What does that look like in terms of monthly costs? Yeah, Liz, you did already. All right, I can see the correct answer, right? So, right, the correct answer there is $1,537 a month, right? That's for a 2-bedroom apartment priced at 80% AMI. Now that's supposed to include utilities, so the rent itself might be a bit under that, but that's based on that HUD Metro AMI, right? So when we use our tax abatements, our public resources for projects, and we say, oh yeah, well, they're great, they're mixed income, they have affordable in them, and they have a handful of units that are affordable at 80% AMI, this is what we're talking about, right? Like this is not a good use of public resources. Yeah, it's not smart, right? And it's, I would argue, morally not correct. Yeah. So right, equity, the concept of equity, right? We all say we want to live in an equitable city, an equitable community, right? That demands, right, that standard, that ideal, it demands that we prioritize folks whose needs are unmet by our current conditions, by our current market, by our current systems, right? And it means then when we look at this graphic and we see that, it means that focusing our public resources to create rental units that are above 60% AMI just based on the data, that's a waste, right? It's not smart policy and it's a waste. Or when you look at this graphic and you look only at renters, right? Anything above 80 in terms of cost burden essentially disappears. That also lets us know that we shouldn't be incentivizing homeownership units above 80% AMI using our public resources, our precious limited public resources, right? Because those things won't advance equity. We can't just call everything affordable. We can't say the need is the same across the whole spectrum. It's not, right? Above those limits, right? Households don't experience the same affordability struggles or anywhere near that neighbors with lower incomes do. I think it's just important to show like the evidence isn't misleading. It's not confusing there. When we look at it with in earnest, there's not much to debate, right? Like our policies, we are making a choice about what we're doing with the things we control and with our public dollars and our public incentives and our public resources. And we're making the wrong choice, right? And we need to shift. We need a systems change to do that. So then like, what is inclusionary housing? Why are we talking about it? Right, inclusionary housing, it's essentially an umbrella term that describes the type of policy that, it requires some affordable housing units within certain market developments in exchange for public subsidies. And like, why do cities use it, right? Cities use it because this type of policy can generate units, affordable units at the price points cities need without drawing from limited public funds for housing, right? So we already kind of demonstrated that the existing money to fund public housing is not nearly enough. So we need to get creative to find other ways to generate housing in addition to those. Cities create trust funds and fund them to create revenue to actually pay for housing. We desperately need that. That is of urgency in our city. But in addition to that, we should be finding creative ways to leverage other things. When cities say that they're strapped for cash, that the federal, the city budget can't sustain, affordable housing in addition to all the other things, right? Well, then why are we not looking to the other in-kind supports and resources that we're offering to development and leveraging that for as much public gain on this affordable housing front as possible? Why else do they do it, right? Well, because to Joelle's point before about how do we tether equity to growth? Inclusionary housing is one of the things that does that, right? That literally says this is where growth is happening, and we are going to tether, equity to it. We're going to tether housing at the lowest price points that the market doesn't care to make to where the market cares to make their housing. It also offers a local solution to the strapped federal resources that Joelle mentioned, right? We have to supplement that somehow, and this is a local way to do it with local control. And lastly, inclusionary housing challenges the way that the private market segregates communities, right? We live in one of the most segregated cities in the country. That is not by accident or doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It happens because of the way the market discriminates and how it invests in people. When we invert that, when we kind of flip that script, even in a small way, that matters for our larger solutions. So tonight, we can kind of see that inclusionary housing obviously has some potential, has something to offer Cincinnati, but we also want to recognize that, right, like this kind of policy has been held up already for a long time by various local community groups as a needed solution. And we wanted to invite a couple of our good partners to share their valuable work that has also articulated this need. So first up, we want to invite Denisha Porter with All in Cincinnati to share some of that good work with us from her end.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Denisha Porter, Executive Director of All in Cincinnati. I lead a racial equity coalition working to dismantle racial inequities in 5 priority areas of health, housing, education, economic mobility, and justice. And so our vision is that everyone in Hamilton County successfully participates and prospers in a just, fair, and inclusive community. Our mission, as I said, is to uplift and elevate Black women in Hamilton County. And our purpose statement, if you can go to the next slide, please, is the purpose of the All in Cincinnati Equity Coalition is to co-create an equitable community in which Black women can live in healthy, safe, opportunity-rich neighborhoods reflecting our culture, connect to economic opportunities, and have influence in decisions shaping our neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So all of our work is done through 3 pillars, and we have a 5-year strategic plan that we will conclude at 2023. Our 3 pillars are truth, racial healing and transformation, truth, telling the truth about racial equity in Hamilton County, racial healing, having those open, honest, bold, and authentic conversations about race and racism. And then transformation is where we do all of our policy and systems work. So as you see below under economic mobility, goal 3, Hamilton County will increase access to jobs that provide pathways to the middle class and will increase the economic security and mobility of vulnerable families and workers, especially Black women facing barriers to employment. Education, Hamilton County will cultivate homegrown talent through a strong cradle to career pipeline. Goal 5, health, Hamilton County will create healthy, opportunity-rich neighborhoods for all. Next slide, please. Goal 6, housing. Hamilton County will increase access to high quality, healthy, affordable homes and prevent displacement. Justice is goal 7. Hamilton County will expand democracy and justice. We will continue to be a high functioning coalition. That's goal 8. And then we will assess everything that we do. That's goal 9. Next slide, please. So we've been working with about 75 coalition members and 20 core team members. And I'm happy to say Joelle Newman is one of our core team members as well. And thus far, we've been able to complete two of our goals or objectives: identify and support the creation of new sources of municipal funding for affordable housing, maintenance, and development, and establish strategies to keep people in their homes during the pandemic. And we were able to do that in partnership with LIST to increase funding to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and then also work with policymakers to establish rental and eviction protection or prevention policies. Next slide, please. So in the All in Cincinnati report that was released in 2018, that had a lot of feedback from community stakeholders, that was created by PolicyLink, there are two strategies that are discussed. One is expand the use of inclusionary zoning. So specifically, this is what it states in the All in Cincinnati report: housing developments located downtown, as well as those along transit and streetcar lines, should be prioritized in order to maximize construction of new affordable units. Montgomery County, Maryland, is the oldest example of inclusionary zoning in the country. Since launching the program in 1974, more than 12,500 units have been produced. While transit-oriented development inclusionary zoning present opportunities to benefit low-income residents, any affordable housing development in downtown should not be prioritized over other neighborhoods in dire need or in high opportunity neighborhoods lacking in housing opportunity. In addition, anti-displacement strategies should be incorporated into development plans in areas targeted for revitalization. Next slide, please. And then the other one is incentivize affordable housing by instituting regulatory waivers. So both of these are identified in the All in Cincinnati report. I encourage you to visit our website, www.allincincinnati.org, to read the entire report. Next slide, please. And some additional goals that we have in our All in Cincinnati report that could be included in an inclusionary housing policy include ensure public investments in community infrastructure, create training and job opportunities for the underemployed and unemployed with emphasis on Black women, support the expansion of businesses owned by people of color, especially Black women, increase the availability of apprenticeships, raise the floor on low-wage jobs, identify and support the creation of new sources of municipal funding for affordable housing, maintenance, and development, facilitate active engagement by all racial and ethnic communities and local planning processes, and just cause eviction protections and rental controls. So thank you so much. I can be reached at denisha.porter@allincincinnati.org.
And so thank you so much, Denisha, and just for the support that All In has definitely offered to our region in thinking about these issues and even the intersection of these issues. Again, as Denisha mentioned, All In has a focus on 5 different focus areas because we know housing intersects with health as much as it intersects with education and justice and economic mobility. And so we thank you all for the work that you've been doing, and also just our next kind of group that we're going to highlight, which is the Housing Our Future group. And so this coalition was kind of coalesced by LISC and led between LISC and also the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. And then we also just want to thank LISC as well as Housing Opportunities Made Equal or HOME for being co-sponsors along with All In and all of our other community co-sponsors for this event. And so next we're going to bring up Laura Castillo, who is the Research and Advocacy Coordinator for HOME, and then also a steering committee member for the Housing Our Future Coalition.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Joelle. I'm really excited about today's conversation and hearing everything that you guys have presented. You guys have done an excellent job. Like Joelle mentioned, my name is Laura Castillo. So I work for Housing Opportunities Made Equal, and I am our Research and Advocacy Coordinator. But that being said, I also serve on the Housing Our Future Steering Committee. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit about the Housing Our Future report, its goals, and how it relates pretty directly to inclusionary zoning. So we can go to the next slide. So just to give you all a little bit of background, the Housing Our Future strategy was released in May 2020, and it was an incredibly collaborative effort, having stakeholders from not only the city, but also the county, representing public, private, and nonprofit sectors. The steering committee and 5 working groups met for over a year to develop the strategy to do a variety of things, but mainly increase access to homeownership, the production of housing units, preserve the preservation of existing affordable housing, equitable zoning and policies, so very relevant, and lastly, increase resourcing and financing to meet those goals. Like I said, I work for Housing Opportunities Made Equal, and as the Fair Housing Agency of Southwest Ohio, we have remained engaged through to the development process, but then we've also served on the steering committee and meet monthly with the rest of the steering committee members. Next slide, please. So just to kind of discuss the vision, the values, and the goals of the report, because I do think that they go hand in hand with a lot of the conversations and the goals and the values when we talk about inclusionary zoning. So the vision of the strategy was that everyone in Cincinnati and the county will have access to quality affordable housing in the places that they want to live. Values: putting people first, promoting choice, fostering diversity, advancing equity, cultivating collaboration, challenging the status quo, and lastly, confronting racist and discriminatory policies and practices. Shifting over to the goals. So goal number 1 was to protect our most vulnerable residents, to preserve and develop long-term affordability, to invest in housing that builds strong, inclusive communities, to create equitable growth without displacement, to build the capacity for development and innovative ownership structures, and then lastly, to provide pathways to sustainable home ownership and generational wealth creation. Here in Cincinnati, we have about a little of a 40% gap between Black home ownership and white home ownership. Housing Opportunities Made Equal actually released a report called The Roadmap to Increasing Black Home Ownership, which are 6 policy recommendations that stem from the Housing Our Future report that directly provide recommendations to increase Black home ownership here in Cincinnati. So just on a side note, I mentioned that report as well. Next slide. So taking a look at the Housing Our Future strategy. So it's actually comprised of 36 key actions to do exactly all the goals that we've just discussed. But it also recommends new resourcing and financing mechanisms that can support these strategies. Now, even though there's only 34 key actions, there actually is over 100 detailed recommendations. So it's incredibly dense and very thorough. And these recommendations are for local jurisdictions, public agencies, nonprofit organizations, philanthropists, lending institutions, and really all the stakeholders across the board. And these recommendations, I do think it's important to note that they are recommendations taking into consideration existing conditions that we see here locally and best practice research. I know that Jen and Joelle have already talked extensively about the housing crisis that we see here in Cincinnati and really nationally, but I do think it's really important. You can't hear it enough, but if we look down at the graphic below, a number that you will hear over and over and over again is that 40,000 affordable housing deficit that we see here in Cincinnati. That being said, we've also seen, and these numbers are from 2020, so they've gone up quite a little bit, but we've seen an increase at 6% from the median gross rent from 2012 to 2016 to 2017. And then we've also seen evictions being filed at higher here in Cincinnati than the Ohio average at 8.7%. And then a little over 12,200 people are the number of individuals served by the homeless system in 2018. Lastly, I think understanding that Cincinnati, I was pretty surprised, but Cincinnati here was just in a report that recently came out, discovered that we have about the 4th in the nation, about the 4th oldest housing stock. So we have very, very old homes, which are very, very expensive to maintain. And that being said, there's also a higher risk of lead paint hazard. So quite a bit of issues that this report seeks to address. Now, going up to the bullets above that graphic, I think that when we're talking about housing production and the need for an increase in production, I think it's important to realize that we have seen an increase in production. So we've seen about an 80% increase in housing production since the Great Recession. So we may not be producing at the rate that we need to be, and we definitely are not producing where we need to be with affordable units, but we have seen an increase. Now, there also has been a 45% increase in the median sale price of a single family home since 2010. And then nearly half of Hamilton County's 300,000 extremely low income households are considered severely cost burdened. So that's about 41,000 households that pay 50% of their income on housing. Now, the report does state that we need at least 20,000 additional affordable units that need to be produced within the next 10 years, which is why it is so important for us to really aggressively fight for recommendations and policies that will start producing those affordable units. Next slide, please. This is probably one of my favorite graphics from the Housing Our Future report, and I think it's really important for us to understand when we talk about who can't afford homes here in Cincinnati. It's a good amount of people. So even if you are so the first line you'll see is that blue line, and that's the minimum income needed to afford a median home with a mortgage. And you'll see that the average registered nurse is not even at that point just yet. And if we look below, we'll see the median income needed to afford a medium 2-bedroom rental. And you'll see quite a few amount of jobs that do not get paid enough to to have affordable housing. So we're talking about retail, we're talking about labor and manufacturing, food service, and customer service representatives cannot afford homes here in Cincinnati. Next slide, please. Lastly, looking at key actions within the Housing Our Future report that directly advance through inclusionary housing policy. I'm going to just highlight 3 of them, but there are quite a few that do go pretty hand in hand. The first one is to modify tax incentives and funding priorities. The second is to reduce displacement and increase access to community benefits agreements. And then the third is to create new incentives for affordable housing. The report is pretty dense and pretty long, but it is really great and has a lot of information. I highly, highly recommend for you all to check it out. It's very accessible. LISC did an amazing job. You can just Google Housing Our Future Cincinnati and you'll be able to see it. But that's all I have for you today. And I want to thank you all for your time and for being at this event today, because it's a really important and engaging conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you, Laura, and thank you, Denisha, both. Again, just both All In as well as Housing Our Future, really helping set the scene and ensuring that we have strategies and then also local data that supports some of these policy, as Laura mentioned, the needed policy solutions to really address kind of the crisis and the need. And so with kind of the framing around inclusionary housing and inclusionary zoning, and specifically the kind of great work that All In and Denisha and then Laura and Housing Our Future really set out for, like a local framework for how inclusionary housing is one of the recommended kind of policies for our city when we think about our housing crisis. Our next kind of section of the event is going to just kind of address some of the myths that are common when you hear about inclusionary housing. And so a lot of times this can be seen as like, especially when it's like a newer policy, it can be seen as like, you know, all of these different things arise around it. And so we want to spend some time kind of doing some myth busting, discussing some of the most common myths, and then kind of some truths related to that. And so our first myth is that this type of policy is not designed for cities like ours. And so in actuality, cities similar to Cincinnati have implemented effective policies, and we're actually really excited to highlight some local cities or some cities that are very comparable to Cincinnati today. But I think, so there are, this type of policy is used by over 700 jurisdictions and municipalities with over 1,000 different programs across the country. And this is used throughout 31 different states. And so there's states kind of coast to coast and everywhere in between. And a lot of cities have been looking to this because it is very flexible and it can flexibly meet specific needs to cities. So as we laid out kind of the need here locally within our city, This type of policy is often thought to only be applied or utilized in coastal cities or cities with extremely strong and competitive housing markets. But it's grown in popularity as more cities see it as like a basic responsible stewardship to ensure that like our public investments are returned with public benefits that the community can feel. And a lot of cities also see it as like a necessary solution to really supplement in making affordable units. We know and we recognize that this type of policy is not going to be the driving force to produce the most amount of units, nor should it be. But when we think about, again, making sure that our city is doing smart business and doing equitable business, it's one of the top ways that cities have seen to ensure that that happens. And so we have a poll question that comes up next, kind of before our next point. And so Liz, could you pull up poll question 3, please? And so this question is kind of gonna give some reference for between Cincinnati and other areas. So what is the most common incentive or subsidy that cities offer to developers to offset the cost of affordable housing and inclusionary housing programs? So what do you think is the most common incentive that people or that cities and jurisdictions use? Okay, and so the majority of folks say the tax abatement, when in actuality, it's actually just bonus density. So most cities that have inclusionary housing policies strictly are able to produce more units on the bonus density or the ability to build higher than the zoning allows alone. Cincinnati is actually unique in its structure of implementing or in its structure of awarding tax abatements. And because of that, it actually gives Cincinnati a unique structure to really craft an inclusionary housing policy that will be specific to our needs. So the kind of downfall of cities that only exchange zoning for units of affordable housing is that it limits feasibly what a market rate project can produce as far as like rents, basically. So what you often see is when there's just an exchange of the zoning, then the affordable units are usually at higher levels or higher price points. But because Cincinnati currently utilizes and awards kind of larger levels of public subsidies, specifically tax abatements, and those are freely given away currently, this speaks even more to why we should be using this type of policy or have this policy in place to ensure that public subsidies like our tax abatements are met with public benefits. But it also really allows a unique opportunity for our city to address our specific needs. So as we kind of laid out earlier, our need isn't really at the 80% AMI for rental units. Our need is at the 60% and below. And because our subsidies that we're currently giving out are larger than that, we should be able to fill that gap for developers with the use of our local subsidies. And throughout the rest of this kind of event and presentation, you'll really hear us talk about Minneapolis and Pittsburgh as kind of 2 case studies through cities that have like recently implemented inclusionary housing policy. And we specifically want to uplift them because their markets are closely resemble to Cincinnati's. Not only their markets, but even the demographics of their city, their makeup of their cities resemble Cincinnati's. They've looked at and used various incentives, not only zoning, as I mentioned. So Cincinnati, we're uniquely positioned to use more than just zoning for our type of policy. They've studied, tested, and analyzed economic feasibility. We'll talk a little later on like what differentiates smart policies from policies that are not effective. And one of the most important factors is the fact that there's like economic feasibility done in testing before kind of setting policy requirements. They've planned around geographic differences in their markets. We know that here in Cincinnati, all of our markets aren't experiencing development the same way, and that impacts the effectiveness of the program or of the policy. So that's a smart decision, as well as they've had successes and garnered wide support to make plans to expand their programs. And I also just want to highlight, we'll talk a little later, but both of these cities implemented their policies like right on the cusp of the pandemic, like they were late 2019. And so kind of all of the successes that will kind of lift up or hold up are really like pandemic mid successes. And so that really makes them kind of even an anomaly on what they're able to produce.
Okay, before I tackle myth 2, I do just want to make one comment about, I know you've heard us use the term inclusionary housing, and then you've also heard the term inclusionary zoning, right? So in case anyone's confused about that, just as Joelle described it, right? Zoning, the bonus density, which is a zoning gift, is the primary mechanism that cities have used to generate the housing. So for that reason, those policies tend to be described as inclusionary zoning, meaning they exchange the zoning for the affordable. Excuse the sirens in the background. But inclusionary housing is sort of the umbrella term that covers inclusionary zoning, but also policies that use other incentives as well. So I just want to be clear there. Inclusionary housing includes, IH includes IZ, but not vice versa, in case anyone's confused. So what's myth number 2? Myth number 2 is, what the heck? This kind of policy is asking way too much of developers. It's not possible. They can't deliver on this public need that we have. In reality, right, this fear or this talking point really like overlooks the fact that valuable public incentives, right, are given to developers to offset the added cost of affordable units, right? Like everybody's going to recognize that if we're requiring developers to do affordable units, they're foregoing some revenue, right, from those units. And that's a cost, right? That's a real cost that we're not going to pretend doesn't exist. But that's why this kind of policy looks to the in-kind support that subsidizes those developments, right? That offsets that cost, that still allows developers to do business with reasonable profits. As Joelle mentioned, right, typically, or most commonly, that's bonus density, but it can also be tax breaks like abatements and TIF stuff. It can be discounted land or free public land. It can be reduced parking. It can be waived fees. Any number of those things can be used alone or in combination with each other to offset those costs, and good policies look at that. We obviously know, right, that in this type of policy, which is by design, it's a public-private partnership kind of policy. It's like, what can we get if we combine our public resources with the capital of the private market in a way that has benefits across that board? We know that, right, for-profit developers just aren't going to build if they can't make a reasonable profit, right? Their job is to make a reasonable profit. Smart inclusionary housing policies, right, carefully look at different requirements and what the impact of those requirements would be on the financial feasibility of projects. So this little graphic here on the right is just a teeny snapshot of the inclusionary housing calculator resource that the group Grounded Solutions Network put out. They are sort of the national experts on this kind of policy. And they created essentially like an interactive development pro forma or budget where you can look at the relationship between requirements for affordable housing and incentives and what's realistic to expect in that exchange that wouldn't tank a project, right? And then, right, good feasibility studies are key to design here. It's not rocket science, but you got to put in the work, right? You got to look, you got to get a good study, get a good consultant to come in and like look at what's financially feasible. Those studies, in addition to looking at kind of new incentives that might be in the mix, they can also look at the existing public incentives and really identify like what the value of those are, right? Like we're so used to in Cincinnati tax abatements just being given out. Like we don't have a sense of what that means for a project, what the value of that abatement is for a project, and what the potential of that could be for the public. So I want to point out at these tables down below, right? The one on the left is from Pittsburgh's financial feasibility. The one on the right is from Minneapolis. Basically, this is a way of looking at different kinds of projects in different areas of the city and with different kinds of incentives and what's doable based on profit and what's not doable based on profit. And that informs the kind of policy that you set. I want to specifically point out that, right, Pittsburgh is one of few cities that does tax abatements like Cincinnati, or I should say did tax abatements like Cincinnati, where everybody's just getting them. And then they were like, hey, can we get something from this? And especially in specific neighborhoods where development's really cranking. And they did the feasibility study and sure enough, they can, right? You might have projects that can't make it on a reasonable profit without a tax abatement, but with a 15-year tax abatement, right? Not only did they get what they needed to get above that threshold, but they got more than that, which means that can sustain the affordable units that we need. This is the kind of feasibility. This is kind of investigation that we need to do to look at what's possible in Cincinnati, because surely something is. So I want to make sure that it can be easy to quickly look at like what else can we give developers, but like we first need to look at what's possible with what we're already giving out. And that's not going to be the same across every, across all neighborhoods, but for sure we know that that there's something to be had in certain neighborhoods where that's cranking.
Mm-hmm. And so the next myth that we want to address is probably the one that we hear the most common, or is the one that's the most rampant. And that's that it would stop development in our city. So the idea that adding more requirements or adding more restrictions on developers would actually just stop or halt market rate development. In actuality, this has not been found to be true. And so among the best studies, the rare finding of impact is nominal. And so there's no reliable evidence that produces or shows this claim to be true. When there are impacts on housing supply found, it's usually assessed and found in small proportions over long periods of time. And IH may even lead to more development in cities with extremely strict zoning requirements. So when you're in areas that have a history of long exclusive zoning or very restrictive zoning, when more inclusive zoning or inclusive housing policies are passed and prioritized, it can actually lead to more production of units, especially with the removal of those restrictive practices, while smartly ensuring that we're tying this uptick in growth to equity and equity gains. And IH policies tend to offer enough offsets to flexibly support the market. And so well-designed policies, as Jen mentioned, smartly balance the economic impact alongside public return for requiring affordable units. So the use not only incentivizes above what the market could get kind of on its own, like out just doing its thing in the market, but again, it ensures that the profit, the extra kind of bump in profit that private developers may make, is tied to ensuring that they're contributing back to the communities and contributing back to the public with this partnership. And so the two graphics kind of on the right side of your screen just demonstrate some of the studies that have been done around overall housing supply and how it's been connected or how it's been seen, or its impact or lack of impact in areas that have long had inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning policies. And then kind of the bottom, the Minneapolis example, again, just this is from their kind of dashboard that they have tracking the units produced from their inclusionary housing policy. And it just demonstrates how when it was applied to 13 specific market rate projects, again, over a 2-year pandemic timeframe, it still produced over 2,000 units with a range of those being at affordable levels.
Yeah, myth number 4 is pretty closely tied to myth number 3, but this idea that like inclusionary housing, this kind of policy would just make market rents more expensive. Sort of comes in 2 theories. It's kind of like just the economic theory is like, oh, this is a tax on developers, which means developers are going to build less, which means that it'll decrease housing supply, and the decrease in housing supply will make the rents more expensive. Or it sort of just says if you tax developers for a given project, they're just going to hand that added cost onto the other residents in the building, right? So we want to look at the evidence on this as well. And the reality is that, again, with the best studies that use the best methods, the most sound methods, right? Inclusionary housing has little to no impact on overall housing prices. So among those highest quality studies, right, where there are good findings that are done relatively reliably, right? The findings range from no increase in prices to at most a 3% increase in new market rate prices. So if that exists at all, if that increase exists at all, right, the increase is negligible in the overall market, right? Where that increase happens, right, is in a specific sector of the market. So it doesn't create some sort of like crazy increase in rents. We haven't seen that anywhere that it's been implemented, or housing costs in general. I want to just point to this similar, right? It's the same graphic that Joelle just used, but a different sector of it, looking at those same studies and what they've said on home prices and rents in terms of the effect. And you can see, right, there's nothing there that's cause for concern in terms of like this, like obviously Obviously everything's going to go crazy and everything else gets more expensive. To the point about like, hey, doesn't this just get handed off to other tenants? I just want to point out that like the for-profit developers, right, their job is to maximize their profits. So they already, independent of an inclusionary housing policy, they already set their rents as high as the competitive market will allow, right, as high as it will bear. When we implement something like inclusionary housing that affects a specific portion of new construction units, it doesn't just like magically increase that threshold, right? It's not like it's a tax on all housing, so everybody increases their rents. You still have to, there's still a bit of that threshold that's governed by other market factors. So what we've seen where this stuff has been implemented is not like, oh, all of a sudden we just have to, the person over here who's paying market rent has to pay double or has to pay this X amount of increase. That's not how it works. You don't depend on those higher rents to subsidize that. You depend on the public subsidy to subsidize it. And then lastly, an important point, just that most of the economic impact in inclusionary housing, where we've seen it actually at work for years, it gets absorbed into land prices. So I know it's a little wonky, but it's just like, what happens when we implement this and we do it stably and we pass a policy that developers know it's transparent, they can bank on it, it's consistent, right? The market adjusts, and where does it primarily do that? It does it in land costs. So, you know, this patch of land downtown, what I'm willing to pay for it right now as a developer is based on what revenue I can get from the rents. If there's some small change in the revenue that I can get in the rents, it means that I'm willing to pay a little bit less in the competitive market for that piece of land. So what ends up coming out in the wash is like, yeah, landowners who have that land maybe accept slightly lower profits for the land. I want to just point out that the inverse of this is when you want to give away the bonus density without requiring any of it. If you want to say, hey, we're just gonna waive our density requirements so everyone can build more densely. The other adverse effect of that is the reverse of this, is that it jams up your land prices, right? It escalates your land prices, which is not good for the overall market either.
And so the last myth that we just want to address is that the research says that it's not effective. So a lot of times what you can hear around inclusionary housing, these type of policies, is that the research is mixed. It really doesn't produce the units, and it's really not an effective policy. So why should we implement it? And in actuality, it's actually the best policies are impactful and effective when designed to be so. So when we think about any type of policy, the best policies are basically based on design and how well they're designed. And again, centralizing the needs, centralizing what the problem is, and ensuring that when you create your policy is created to address those. And so kind of looking at specifically at our two kind of case study cities in Pittsburgh and Minneapolis. So in September of 2019, Pittsburgh established a pilot inclusionary housing program in just one of its neighborhoods. So again, kind of right before the pandemic, and then also some other kind of production issues regarding like lumber and things. And even just without it being in multiple neighborhoods, it actually has produced 40 units that are income restricted at 50% AMI. And so in this past January, Pittsburgh's City Planning Commission actually unanimously just recommended that they make that policy permanent. So the pilot policy is now permanent in that one neighborhood, and they actually just voted to expand it to 2 additional neighborhoods to be used for this policy. So again, the city department as well as the city council in Pittsburgh is seeing this as an effective policy in just its one neighborhood. It's one of its strongest markets, but the fact that they've been producing at least 40 units over the last 2 years. And so we have also our last poll question kind of before moving to Minneapolis, our second case study. So if Liz, if you could pull up, I think it's poll question 4 or 5, yeah. So Minneapolis's inclusionary housing policy targets its affordable units at 60% AMI and below. It has been in effect for slightly more than 2 years. In that time frame, how many of the affordable units has it generated? So any guesses on how many units have been generated from Minneapolis's policy? And so I think we are split right between 113 and 212. And Minneapolis has produced 212 units since it implemented its policy in December of 2019. So as I mentioned, both Pittsburgh and Minneapolis implemented their policies right before the pandemic, Minneapolis even more so than Pittsburgh. So it implemented it in December of 2019, and it has applied to 13 market rental projects that have come through the city since then. And it's produced 212 units at 60% AMI. And so not only has this policy that Minneapolis had produced units, but it's also produced a little over $5.5 million in lieu of fees to directly support the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so as I mentioned, we know that and we recognize that inclusionary housing is not going to be the end all be all for producing the most amount of units at the levels that we need. But it's most effective in helping to supplement, again, those policies such as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, who does have the resources to reach those lower incomes or reach the unit production in mass. And it doesn't just rely or restrict on that. And so just kind of some context for where we are here in Cincinnati. So from the most recent report from the city, Cincinnati currently produces or preserves about an annual average of about 30 units that are income restricted to households making about 50% AMI or below. So again, kind of central to that need that we laid out earlier. But these units are funded solely by federal or state pass-through dollars. And so the figures on the units that we showed in Minneapolis and Pittsburgh, those units were created in addition to units that are generated by federal or state restricted dollars. And so currently our city of Cincinnati, we're missing out on the additional stream of affordable units that could be produced by putting requirements on the awarding of our public subsidies. Just to highlight, Pittsburgh specifically has been able to produce its 40 units on awarding tax abatements alone to private projects. And so not with using its Affordable Housing Trust Fund funds, but just when awarding the tax abatement to those projects, it was able to produce 40 units. And so with a policy similar to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati could likely more than double the number of units that we're currently producing at our lowest levels or at the levels that we need. And this all occurs without using resources by way of cash, but instead, again, placing those requirements on the incentives. And this type of policy isn't a substitute, as I want to just highlight again, for additional equity housing policies that are needed, such as a strongly funded trust fund that is properly oversight and distributed out into the neighborhoods, or with additional stronger renter protections, such as anti-displacement and good cause eviction policy. But this type of policy helps supplement by adding an additional stream of being able to create more affordable units and put more units online for the households and the families who currently can't find units to support themselves.
Great. So before we go to Q&A, and again, you can be popping your questions into the chat whenever you'd like. I want to just, expand on what Joelle was just saying about design, right? Like, yeah, these policies have different outcomes and different impacts and effects, and that's because the design of them matters, right? What we want them to do, we have to smartly assess and incorporate into a design. That's not crazy. It's not outlandish. Many cities have done it. There are teams of experts that can help cities and do help cities regularly do that so that they don't have to figure it all out on their own. And that's where we have to go. That's the path we need to take. So what goes into an inclusionary housing policy design? This is a graphic from Grounded Solutions Network. It's not super complicated, even though it's got a few moving parts, right? Like how you structure your program. Is it mandatory? Is it voluntary? Is it fee-based? What incentives are you going to use, right? Are you going to use density? Are you going to use tax breaks? Any of the things we already talked about. What options for compliance are there? If you're going for on-site units, do you offer alternatives in order to still capture something from developments and make it flexible enough for developers? Where does it apply? What size housing projects would it apply to? Is it specific to a particular geographic area? And then and then lastly, like, what are your requirements, right? Like, how much of what proportion of the units, what percentage do you want to see it affordable, and at what price points, for how long, what's the term of that? What are some other things you got to think about in terms of the design of those units? These are all really important things, like you have to look at, assess, you have to debate, and you have to choose intentionally in the design. A few things we know from national best practices, right, is that mandatory policies generate many more affordable units than voluntary ones. The two cities that we're highlighting tonight actually have kind of like two layered policies. They have a lower threshold of requirement that's mandatory, and then they have a higher level that kicks in more public subsidy. That's really smart to do in cities like ours. But we know this is a major takeaway nationally, that if we want to produce the units, that having some mandatory element of the policy is key. Affordability requirements must make units at needed price points. I know we've hit you over the head with this all night, but like, why would we invest all this time and energy and effort into making a policy that's going to create units at price points that's already served by the market? It's not smart. Economic analysis is key. Again, do a feasibility study, have experts come in and do a feasibility study, and specifically make sure that study challenges the assumptions that abound in our local environment, right? And you have to consider the right variables, right? What are the variables that actually really kind of determine the economic feasibility? You got to be specific about that and smart about that. Recognizing that flexibility is important to make an effective policy. It can't just be super, super rigid and one size fits all. It tends to not work out very well there, but you got to be really smart about how you build in flexibility so that you don't just offer easy opt-outs. One major mistake that other cities have made in years past is, yeah, they make a cool policy, but then they say, oh, if you can do an in lieu fee, and they set the fee way too low. So obviously everybody throws a little bit of money at it, and it doesn't have the effect or the promise. It doesn't meet the standards that you hoped it would meet. So how do you tether those? How do you balance those wisely? And then where you do make decisions about how to balance things, right? Like, if you want your inclusionary housing policy to really meet some integration goals, or you really want it to hit the lowest price points possible, or you really want it to include good jobs and wages or other community benefits, you might find ways to design it so that you sacrifice some of the overall units to hit some of those important goals of yours. But whatever you do, you got to make sure it reflects people's priorities, right? And the city's need and the public's need. So what do we want it to do, and how do we make sure we design it to do that? All right, I want to, it's about 7:09. We've got some time to answer questions. I hope for anyone who hasn't already typed questions into the chat feature, just know it doesn't go to the full group. It goes to Liz, who's doing all the hard tech work behind the scenes, and she's been sorting those as they come in, and Liz is going to kind of read off to us a couple of the better questions and important stuff that people have raised or want us to address. If you haven't gotten your questions in, or something you want us to speak to, please go ahead and use the chat feature to share that with us.
Okay, so this one is a bit of a multi-part question. Says, how does the standard of the housing affect the issue? If housing is available, what percentage is actually healthy and livable? Are there ways to provide funds for making repairs to landlords and homeowners? Also, what is the relation to construction workers and living wages?
Joelle, you want to speak to any of those bits? I have some thoughts, but give you the first crack.
Yeah, I think you should go first, and then I'll hop in.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm fully if this fully addresses what the participant intended, but I think there's one bit that, like, the standard of affordable housing is an overall concern, right? Because we hear a lot about, like, naturally occurring affordable housing, which really just generally means, like, landlords have stopped investing in that and have stopped keeping a building up to code or up to standard. So it's cheap or it's affordable because it's not being well kept or it's substandard. I think one thing that is important about inclusionary housing, or the potential of it, is that you are incentivizing new units in new buildings that are actively where investment is happening. So I think where you can create those units, it does address that head on, right? It's not just going to say, oh, our plan for poor folks in our city is that we're just going to build stuff at the high end because we're only focused on general supply, and then everybody with some income is just going to move up a notch, and that will clear out some space in the lowest standard housing for folks who can't afford anything more. I think that's one major pitfall of some of the conversations I think happening at the citywide level right now, is like really thinking through, like, what does that policy mean for our people, our community members who can't afford the rents at those price points and the standard of the housing that's going to be available to them. Is that our plan? Is that what our game plan is going to be? Is that acceptable? Is that ethical? So I think that's, I don't know that that's really what the question was gunning for, but I think the only other thing I wanted to add, and again, I don't know if this is what they intended, but one concern that's sometimes voiced with inclusionary housing is that if people are building a multifamily unit, and you're building many units and you have to do some at affordable levels, do you just make those lower standard units? You just put folks at the income restricted units in the basement or at the back end, and you have all these fancy amenities, but those people can't access them. I think cities have gotten smart to address that in the design of their policy. So specifically, even at these two cities we're looking at, the laws are written, the policy is written so that those units have to be comparable in every way in terms of the basics with the other units, that any shared amenities have to be accessible to all in the building, and that as a way, they have to be kind of dispersed randomly throughout the building. You can't just like put folks in subsidized units together. So I think I don't know, those are some thoughts on standard. I don't know if that fully answers, but
yeah, and I guess just to the second part of the question, specifically I think regarding wages and construction earning, we specifically at Peaslee with the equitable development rubric, we were intentional of knowing the fact, again, as we mentioned, that housing is two sides of the same coin. So one is the price of the housing, and then the second is the wages that people are given. And so when we think about the potential for an inclusionary housing policy, when we specifically that offers there's flexibility in what could be connected as far as requirements or expectations. And so we, with the rubric and kind of its framework, wanted to address, again, both the housing affordability side and then the jobs and labor side. And knowing that those are both difficult to do together, but again, with the ability to combine some of our incentives and things like that, and then having certain accountability expectations placed within the policy, it could still be creatively done. So ensuring that we're not undercutting one side, not undercutting wages for the sake of housing affordability or vice versa.
I do believe also in Minneapolis, where they have a higher requirement, proportion requirement, where where tax break and TIF assistance kicks in. The way they already had a law was that the use of those funds did already require some prevailing wage standards. So in construction of the building, that contractors had to pay the prevailing wage for the trades in the construction of the building. And I know that was taken into account when they did their economic feasibility study, right? So paying prevailing wage might bump a construction hard cost 10% roughly. So that's going to be taken into consideration. So I think where we have the opportunity to look at those things and we can fold them in together, that's just smart, knowing that these things they're not in isolation. They're two sides of the same coin. And to fix the problem, we gotta address both ends.
Sorry, trying to look at so many things at once. So another question, well, there are a couple questions that I think have a similar answer. So I'm going to kind of group them. But one is, what about community ownership with stakeholders working together to have the capital backing of the community, which reminds me of land trusts. And I think we're sort of saying that's an additional piece of the puzzle. Similarly, what about rent control and rent stabilization? So I know you did say earlier, part of building affordable housing is making sure that it's affordable in perpetuity. And I think maybe this is about, an additional piece that speaks to existing property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just say that, this inclusionary housing, we we've often touted along some of those other inclusive and equitable housing solutions to our housing crisis. Like we know rent control and rent stabilization is an additional piece, again, to like good cause eviction and ensuring that people aren't displaced, by ways of basically just reckless displacement with no type of protections for renters, and then also ensuring that there's not just ability to completely astronomically hike up folks' rent and displace them that way as well. So ensuring that those type of requirements are in place, again, for established housing, but then the ability to in perpetuity produce units at affordable levels. Yeah, Jen, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, that's right on. I think the other thing is that other cities have used, so inclusionary housing, to be clear, right, can be used for rental housing. It can also be used for homeownership. I think more often on the homeownership front, when those houses get made, right, who manages that homeownership and who kind of does the monitoring or the management of how those deeds get passed on with the income restrictions. I think there have been definitely policies where land trusts, community land trusts, which essentially are like entities that hold land that's unhinged from the market, that are run by community folks or run in collaboration. Sometimes that happens at the government level or with government support. Sometimes that happens totally separately with nonprofits, but like that's a viable option for how you would make sure that the affordable units that get generated by your policy get managed well, and get where the oversight is good. I think that is an important thing to think about. To the question about like rent control, or more specifically good cause eviction policy, where those policies are really, really important for us to pass holistically across the city, but can be really challenging to do. The other thing about a thing like inclusionary housing policy is like we look to where we do have control, or we have potential control, right? So we do have the ability to put requirements or restrictions on our incentives in a way that we don't have to pass or on all private property everywhere. So definitely you could use an inclusionary housing policy to say good cause eviction applies to all of the properties that are in the inclusionary housing program, right? That's one way to do it. And you could look to how, something, it's slightly different, but also important. You can, other cities have definitely said, hey, inclusionary housing projects also are required to accept housing vouchers. So say the affordable units in them are only hitting about 60% AMI. One way to make them or allow them to hit those lower price points is that you require those landlords to accept the fair subsidy from the government to basically make them whole for the fair rent, but also meet a household's need at a lower price point. So those are just like some controls that you can, obviously you still want to do it smartly, but you have opportunity to fold some of those into an inclusionary housing policy. You still need to do it more widely, but where you can have the leverage, I think it's smart to use it.
So this one says, considering the history of zoning and density requirements are born out of racism, why should we continue to limit density, even if to give a boost to affordable projects? I think we would maybe say we're not trying to limit density. We're just trying to ask for something in return. But you all speak to that.
Yeah, and I would say that's exactly right. I feel like the idea of just removing density without any type of expectation or without any type of requirement attached kind of connects to what we were talking about with the central problem and the central need. So the fact that the market naturally discriminates, and just removing and expecting them to just, because they have the ability to build more, and then if they can build more, then maybe they could lower the rents. Like we can't function kind of off of that assumption or that expectation. So just ensuring that when the density is awarded and when it happens, that there are, again, like community benefits that are directly tied, and ensuring that those community benefits are like accounted for and are tangible or like directly felt by the community. So just, again, tying it more to equity. And we at Peaslee, we kind of spoke a little to some of the zoning things in one of our presentations that we did at City Hall, and even the conversation around single family zoning and that legacy of discrimination and how that's been used to segregate communities by race and class. And so when thinking about those type of things, Minneapolis specifically has like completely done away with their single family zoning. So that city like no longer has single family zoning, similar to Cincinnati, which I think is like out of its housing zone is like zone 75% single family. But they also also with the removal of the single family zoning, just ensured that with their density awarding, it was directly tied to a requirement, and they have a mandatory policy. So no matter what you build in the city, whether you're tapping into public funds or not, at a certain level, at a certain amount of units that you produce, you have to produce affordable units. And then if you want to tap the public funds, that kind of ratio or that percentage of units that you produce at an affordable level is higher. So again, just kind of directly tying density to equity.
I think it's important to discern too, like which zoning policies are more directly tied to like racist outcomes versus they're just mechanisms that have been used to that end. And then, so that means that like when we remove them, what can we expect to happen, right? So I think some of them are more obvious, like, yeah, where it doesn't make sense to have the whole city zoned to single family because it makes it impossible to build affordable housing, right? That's a smart one to remove because you create the opportunity. But allowing for affordable housing to be created is not the same as ensuring that it gets created, right? So I think where you have the opportunity to tether those together, you're essentially structuring or prioritizing that those mechanisms with the flip get used to advance equity and not just saying you're allowed to do equity now, right? Like, and I think we have to be really, really smart and really intentional in how we discern the difference, right? We could do away with all the zoning restrictions, and it doesn't mean obviously tomorrow we're going to be an equitable city because the market's still going to discriminate the way that it does. So how do we do it smartly? And Liz, I think maybe we've got time for like one more question and then we'll throw it to Jen. Yeah.
Yep. I'm gonna bundle another couple, sort of. So one question is, do we know of any local developers that favor this policy? We don't have a policy yet. That's what we're talking about. And, you know, tune in on May 31st for our event on how we would get started building one and building that support. Another one says, do we have a set of specific rules or incentives that will be proposed to city leadership? I heard you say that one size doesn't fit all, but do you have specifics as to how we can implement without unintended consequences on traffic, sewer, et cetera? And I think to that, we would also say that's part of the research that goes into building the policy, which isn't a thing yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like the economic feasibility part is like super essential. And building the policy, I will say to the question as far as like subsidies used, I think was included kind of in the second half of that question. We've mostly pinpointed like any type of kind of public benefit or any type of combination of that. So specifically a bump in density or additional density that's awarded to projects, like free land that developers free public land that developers may be awarded. And then again, as we mentioned, like specifically tax abatements, and then also the use of like TIFs, whether that's TIFs from a specific TIF district or a project-based TIF, which is like usually used for extremely large projects. So any of those subsidies, the use of those subsidies, we believe should trigger the requirement of some type of community benefit. And we've seen in different cities, like the number of units kind of also implementing or impacting, whether that's triggered or not. But those are kind of like the most subsidies that we recommend using.
And just to touch briefly again on the whether developers favor it, I think our experience with our rubric has been developers like to know what the expectations are. They like to know the parameters. And so if the policy is clear, then they will be appreciative of that.
And also that we have 2 developers on in our list of co-sponsors tonight. And I think it's important to honor that. And, you know, we don't necessarily have a written out policy that we're advocating for in this moment. I think we definitely have strong feelings about what should or shouldn't be a part of what we look at. But I think the fact that developers are open to this conversation, that good longtime community developers know that this conversation is overdue, that they've long advocated for policy and structural change, and they know more than anyone how hard it is to make the numbers work at the bottom, you know, for these rents that you know, really don't pay for themselves. I think, yeah, I think that speaks strongly to you know, the coalescing of the call to action here. I want to honor the time that we committed folks to today. So I want to throw it to our Peaslee's director, Jen Summers, to kind of finish us off with a closing thought.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. As we wrap up for the evening, I'd like to again thank all of you who joined us tonight to learn together about inclusionary housing policy for Cincinnati. We appreciate our co-sponsors for this event and want to commend all of these groups for their work. Additionally, Peaslee is also grateful for support from the Murray and Agnes Season Good Government Foundation for their ongoing support. We are inspired each day by committed neighbors who show up consistently to learn together, to bring knowledge of their communities to bear and decisions about where they live. We believe in the power and the possibility of this leadership. Our work together showing up with and for each other illustrates the strength and vision that our city needs to move forward justly in this moment. Inclusionary housing policy is one critical tool that can systematically change our priorities as a city. And we have a choice to make, and it is not, we do have a choice to make, but it's not unfettered development or no development at all. We can choose to maintain our growth at any cost policies with a mere wish that we will end up with a city that is built for everyone. Or we can decide to use our assets and incentives in smart, just, and proven ways to invest in with equity in housing for working class taxpayers, including nurses and laborers and service workers and caregivers who form the backbone of our city. We appreciate all of your time tonight and all of the times in between where you are working to choose a pathway for yourself and your neighbor. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for questioning, learning with us, building, and taking action. We hope you'll share this session with a neighbor or a colleague and invite them to join the next session in the series on Tuesday, May 31st at 6 p.m. via Zoom, where we'll take a deeper dive and continue to look at similar cities and what's possible for Cincinnati. Thanks so much for being with us tonight and for all of your work.